Back in 2001, I began seeing some trends that were disturbing to me in the developmental world. I've maintained a blog for a number of years, and I began to write about it. I'm saying things are changing, and we need to change the way we're doing things. And most of the people that read my blog and commented on it were thinking that I was an alarmist, and it was really too early to make those kinds of prognostications. Then 2008 came, and there was a horrible financial crash that most of us are familiar with. And then people began to think, well, maybe he did know what he was talking about, but they still didn't want to do anything about this because it was basically being labeled by the press as a recession. And in the course of the 40 or some years that I've been doing this kind of work, I've been through several recessions. And basically the attitude for those of us that went through those times is that it's going to be for a season, and then at the end of the season we're going to just kind of get back and do essentially the same things we'd always done. And for most of those recessions, that was exactly the case. I mean, there were losses that people experienced, and that was disappointing. But nonetheless, the economy tended to bounce back, and some of the losses that we incurred, we probably didn't make up. I think I probably, in the previous recession prior to this one, lost about 60% of my retirement. And I finally came to the conclusion after that recession that I was going to be working for a long, long time. But and that was true with a lot of Americans. And then all of a sudden 2008 comes, and we have probably the greatest financial crisis in 70 years. In fact, I've taken the liberty of calling it our recession because this was unlike any other quote-unquote recession. This was having a deep impact on the attitudes of people, very similar to what the Great Depression did. People became frightened because they came into the situation with something. They didn't have margins in their financial world, and so consequently a loss of income or a loss of a job meant really crisis, significant crisis for them. We had more foreclosures in America than any other time in recent history. People were losing jobs. They were becoming unemployed as well as underemployed because many times they were cut in their hours because of just the cost of maintaining employees. And in many instances, they lost their jobs, obviously, altogether. And so it really has been an attitudinal thing. And that hasn't come back nearly as quickly as what they say the economy has come back. In other words, people are still fearful, they're still saving, they're still not spending money to the degree that they did. And that's true in our country, and I suspect it's true in yours as well. This is not just a crisis that was in America. Essentially, America caused a crisis that impacted a great number of countries around the world. And so we have what I call a series of tsunamis. We have all heard about tsunamis. It was kind of interesting that, especially when the Japanese earthquake hit, we got to see them live, on YouTube, because it happened during the day, and they knew that there was a tidal wave on the way in, and so they had helicopters that were tracking them from the moment they approached shore, and you could see when they hit shore the damage, the incredible amount of damage that was caused. A wave that came in not only just made a big splash, but it would go in for 2 and 3 miles and destroy everything in its wake. And so we've chosen to use the analogy of a tsunami to kind of talk about things that are happening in the world today that basically reflect a tsunami. Usually in a tsunami, the first wave is just perhaps the largest one, but it's always followed by other waves that are going to have equally as damaging impact. There was a movie a number of years ago, and perhaps you've seen it. It was called The Perfect Storm, and George Clooney was a captain of a ship that sailed out of New Gloucester in Massachusetts, or Gloucester, Massachusetts, and he became the victim of what was called the perfect storm. And a perfect storm is when you have two meteorological. I've been really having trouble with monosyllabic words this day. I couldn't even say that right. But when two weather fronts come together and merge at the same time at the same place. And so in the perfect storm, as you remember if you've seen the movie, there came a time, and literally there was just really no overcoming the damage that could happen. I mean, they realized that they were in danger, and obviously it resulted in their lives. But the point is that we've had two similar things happen in the philanthropic world. The first one, obviously, was the economic crisis. The economic crisis was devastating for businesses. It's been devastating for organizations. Typically, what we do when we find ourselves in a difficult situation, if you're in the place to be able to do it, you tend to, either cut expenses or increase income. I mean, those are the two areas to deal with crisis when it happens to an organization. So a lot of organizations had cut expenses, but they'd done it earlier. I mean, much before this actually hit in all its fury in 2008. But they'd already cut expenses, and it was very, very difficult to increase their income because they were losing so much income from donors that weren't donating anymore and making the kinds of contributions they'd made in the past. I remember, Sue and I lost probably 80% of our income overnight because we were doing consulting work, and predominantly our consulting work in those years was basically managing a lot of major capital funding campaigns. We were raising money for colleges and schools and churches, and some of them were multi-million-dollar campaigns to raise money for new facilities and so forth. And almost overnight, every single one of those contracts was canceled. Now, they had some reasonably good fees attached to them, and so essentially we just, all of a sudden we lost our income, and it wasn't coming in, from other sources. And so here we are, not in financial hurt, but still somewhat stable. But all of a sudden we discovered that our giving budget was actually probably 3 times exceeded our income budget, because we had made a budget on charitable gifts that was based upon a larger income than what we were receiving, obviously. And so we had one night, this come to Jesus moment. And I finally looked at Sue and I said, we just can't continue to go this way. And she says, no, I know we can't. And so we have to do something. And the only place that we had to cut was in our charitable giving. And so we had this little exercise. And it was really rather interesting because we kind of learned some things about ourselves and as well as what was important to us. But we put a bunch of envelopes on our dining room table, and each of them representing an organization or an individual that we were financially supporting. We kind of put them on the table, and I said to Sue, okay, this is the amount of money that I think we can continue to maintain, and we're going to have to cut quite a bit in order to get down there. And so why don't you do this? We'll both walk around this table for a week or two, and let's put into the middle of the pile those that are for all practical purposes sacred, and we're not going to stop no matter what, and then let's see what we have left over. Well, the first round, even with the ones that we said we were never going to cut, it still exceeded by about 20% what it is that we were able to do, what we knew we could do. And it wasn't even more what we could do. Even that was extravagant because we didn't have that much income to begin with. But we had enough savings that we felt we could kind of endure this process. So we had to go through it again, and eventually we came up with a list, and then I had to make this set of horrible phone calls and text messages, and mostly phone calls, sometimes emails, depending upon where the persons were. Many of them were friends we'd been supporting for years, and so we just can't do it anymore. It's just because, it's not because of you, obviously. And many of you that are missionaries, and some of you are here in this room that are basically receiving money or had received money from people in America. And I suspect that you maybe got an email or two, or you saw your income go down as well. So that was a crisis, and it was a difficult crisis for us. We've begun to add again, which is really encouraging to each of us. But the realities are, it was a challenging time. So the economic crisis has had its impact on individuals, and it's had its impact on organizations. We have had more foreclosures of churches in America in the last year than in the history of America. More foreclosures. And it used to be that a bank would never foreclose on a church because it's just kind of like bad PR. The bank comes in and says, okay, we're going to close your church. And, this is not something that banks like to do because it really doesn't, it's not really great public relations. And so, they would be very, very patient with churches. But essentially, they were forced to do it for reasons that became part of the Economic Recovery Act, that banks were really demanding or being demanded to come and take these bad debts and basically do something about them. Now, in America, even today, banks are not, virtually banks have stopped totally loaning to churches, for growth purposes. They're just not looking at it as a good investment and all, and they probably have greater insight in many respects to what is happening in the world of the church than many of the people that work there, and I'll explain that perhaps a little bit more clearly in just a few moments. So you have the economic crisis, and that alone, that crisis alone, that tsunami wave alone, created a lot of damage, and there was a lot of changing of the topography, if you please, of the world that we know. Then the second thing that came, and about the same time, which was something that was far more serious in many respects than the economic crisis, was the demographic crisis. And that's the one that really has had the greatest impact and will have the greatest impact on philanthropy and upon your ministries in the next 10 or 15 years. We have in America what we call generations, and your generations, we all have generations, and how they're measured in different countries may be different. But in our country, we have a group of people that were born between 1925 and 1946, and they're called the Builders. We just call them the Builders because they were the post-World War II generation that literally built the infrastructure for what became the most powerful economy in the world. They were able to pick up the ashes from what it is that had happened as a result of the war, all the impacts upon our country, and basically worked really, really hard to build a strong infrastructure upon which their successors could build. And the Builders, 1925 to 1946, I'm a builder, so I'm in that category. I'm kind of on the late side of the Builders, but I'm one of the Builders, and that's my generation. Now, they were followed by the Boomers. You've heard the phrase baby boomers. Well, that was the generation that was born between 1946 and 1964. Now, there are 50 million, just some numbers that will be important for you to remember as we're kind of walking through this process. There are 50 million builders. There are 78 million boomers. Okay, so that's a pretty good chunk of people. And they are the most generous and have been the most generous generation in world history. The work of philanthropy around the world in many instances has been born on the backs of the Builders and the Boomers. They have been extremely generous. They have supported organizations like yours. They continue to support organizations like yours. In fact, in 2013, the last full year from which we have charitable records, over $400 billion was given in America in 2013. And 90% of that was either given and or driven by baby boomers. Now, 90% of $400 billion is $360 billion. And $360 billion was either given, they're either making the gifts themselves or they're driving those gifts. They serve on the boards of charitable foundations and they're making the decisions in terms of what their church is going to do and releasing money to organizations like yours. They are either giving or driving, all that giving. $360 billion a year. And we're going to come back and kind of take a look at that in just a few moments because that's a number that you need to know, and that's a fact that you must begin to process, in the context of the organizations that you represent. Okay, the next generation is the generation born between 1964 and 1980. And that generation in our country is called the X generation. And there are 48 million people in the X generation. So, 50 builders, 50 million, 78 baby boomers, 48 X gens. Now, this is a group that's starting to age as well because someone born in 1980, right now, that would make probably the youngest of the X-Gens would be about 36 or 37 years old, somewhere in that category, and up to, in their middle and late 50s now. So they're getting, older. They give 8% of the total amount of money that's given in the United States. So 8% of 400 billion is what, 32 billion or something of that nature. So they're giving, and they're giving generously, at least for their size, probably not as generous as their fathers, because in every generation, the tail end of the last generation looks more like the front end of the next generation. See, I was born in 1944, which is just right on the edge of the baby boomers, and I probably look more like a boomer than I look like a builder. And so that's very, very true with the X-Gens as well. Those that were born, in 1997, 98, 99, look more like Millennials or more like Y-Gens than they look like X-Gens. And I think, you know people, so you can probably make your own determination whether that's true in your world or not. So we have 48 million. They give 8%, sizable amount of money, but obviously not sufficient to pick up the losses that we're going to realize as baby boomers begin to retire and then eventually begin to die. Then the next generation, and this is like extremely important to know. You better, and people, you didn't listen to, it's kind of interesting. My career, practically speaking, if anybody was born in the right time to do development, I was born in the right time. Because essentially I got the best of the builders and probably all of the boomers. And so I've been able, by God's wonderful grace, to be able to help organizations raise multiplied millions of dollars. But it was only because I was just born at the right time. This was where money was, abundant. People were making very, very generous gifts. And we just really caught that wave. And so I'm thinking now, as I'm kind of moving into what might be called retirement for some, I'm not thinking about retirement in particular. I'm kind of thinking into sliding into something that looks a little bit different than what it is that I've done for the last 40 years, which means I've been driving or flying 160 days a year, probably consistently for the last 30 years. And so I'm thinking I'm just going to slow down now a little bit, stay home and enjoy Sue and the family and the grandchildren and the dogs, that we enjoy all of those things. And then all of a sudden this hits, and I'm in more demand now than I've ever been, because everybody all of a sudden became aware of the fact that we face crisis and we don't know what to do about it. And so I'm now speaking at conferences and conventions all over the place, trying to help organizations understand what are we going to do in the light of the situation. Now let's talk about that situation. We haven't talked about the Y-Gens yet. Those born between 1980, there's really no official cutoff date on those. There will eventually be. Someone's going to say, okay, we're going to draw a line in the sand. It's going to stop at 2000 or whatever the case might be. But nobody's really come up with something that's decisive yet. So basically, we're counting people born between 1980 and 2014, and there's over 100 million of them, which makes them the largest generation in American history. So it's a really large group of people. And it's the largest generation in world history as well, because that generation is really expanding all throughout the world, with some obviously notable exceptions where birth control basically prevents the kind of growth that we're experiencing in other places in the world. But overall, it kind of balances out. Now, let's talk about the millennials. There's things about the millennials that are really, very interesting to me. First of all, they're incredibly self-confident. You have as a generation, most of you, really believe that, the things that basically are needing to be done in the world, are worthy to be tackled, and we're going to solve the problems. And they really do have a lot of self-assurance. They have a great deal of self-confidence, and they're very, very smart, and they're very well educated. Virtually your generation, the majority of your classmates probably when you graduated from high school went on to university, and they're preparing for professions that basically are going to be effective and really impacting the lives of others. And that is a very interesting characteristic of millennials, is that they're very concerned about social issues, much more so than their fathers and parents were. It's not that they weren't interested. The fathers and parents whom they look at as being hypocrites, despite the fact that they love and respect them. Which is, that's kind of a paradox. It doesn't really make an awful lot of sense, but they're seeking, the millennials as a generation are more aggressive in seeking mentors than any other generation. The boomers and the builders were kind of living this, I'm going to do it myself. They're going to build something themselves because that was really something that was really important. But they're not feeling that way at all. And so they really seek mentors for help, usually from the previous generations. And so they are, different, but they see their parents as hypocrites primarily because Dad's way or Grandpa's way of being able to deal with crisis was to write a check. In other words, we have a crisis in Somalia, and Grandpa says, "You're kidding." And he says, "Give me my checkbook, dear." And he writes a checkbook for $1,000 and gives it to you and says, "Go do something about it." And their children or grandchildren saying, "Well, that's hypocritical. Why don't you just go out and do something about it yourself, and put your money and your life, behind something that's really going to make a meaningful difference." And so they're very, very socially conscious, and they're very, very involved in life. Now, there's some perhaps not so noble qualities, or at least I'm not suggesting that they're not noble. I'm just suggesting that it's a characteristic that essentially does impact what it is we might expect from them in terms of philanthropic activity. Most of them, the average tenure in America of a millennial in a job is about 2 years. They just kind of move around from job to job, and they only make as much money as they need in order to do what it is they want to do. In other words, they're just kind of like, well, I want to do this, and I need so much money to do this, and so I'll work, so that I can do this. I have some incredibly dear friends and people that I know that are millennials. There's one guy that, I've known him since he's been a little guy. His dad worked for me. He was, and we kind of help raise these kids, through our business. And when he graduated from high school, he went, and this is that we lived in Colorado at the time, and so he just packed up and went to Vail, which is one of the primary ski areas in the United States. And he was just like snowboarding for a living. I mean, this was what he really liked to do. He just loved to snowboard. And he worked as taking lift tickets, during the snow season. And got on the snowboard as much as he could, and he just loved it. And every time I'd see him, and he didn't appreciate this, and I probably was absolutely stupid to do it, but I kept looking and I said, "Zach, when are you going to get a real job?" What we did when we went to college and we got a job, and he said, "I'm never going to get a job." And so and this goes on and on and on and on. This is like Zach, and he's a wonderful kid. And I'm going to give you a website, and you can check to see how wonderful he actually is. But Zach, and then he thought, well, man, I need to do something because, my lift ticket is only like good in winters, so I'm making money in the winter, but I'm not doing really well in the summer. So he started taking up photography, and he was doing some weddings and stuff, and it was, he was doing okay, but not really great. And so somebody gave him this new company that was starting in the photography business, a GoPro camera. Now, some of you know what a GoPro camera is. It's just a pretty inexpensive camera where you can do a lot of action shots and so forth. And he got really, really, really good at it. And he was the first full-time photographer ever hired by GoPro. And he is the most watched photographer on Instagram in the world today. He's probably making $250,000 a year, and he's living the life that he wants to live. I mean, he lives in a sailboat that's parked in Sausalito in California. Half of the pictures that you'll find on Instagram are basically him on a sailboat, and he is always everywhere. I mean, I check him on Instagram all the time now because he's one of my most admired people. Forbes magazine said if you watch anybody that does action photography, you need to watch Zach Shellhammer, and that's his name, Zach, Z-A-K, and it's S-H-E-L-H-A-M-E-R, Shellhammer. Go check his stuff. You're going to be really impressed. And here's the guy, that basically said, I'm just going to kind of do what it is that I like to do, and I'm borrowing money from Zach, or I'm thinking about it anyway. I'm going to start a new business, Zach. I was wondering if I could borrow a couple $100,000. It's just one of these interesting stories, and I suppose there's a whole lot more, but that's one at least that I know really pretty well. But and I know him very well. Actually, I played Words with Friends with him, which is like a little online Scrabble game. And he really learned how to spell, or he's got a great dictionary. But I tell you, I'm thinking, well, I didn't even know you could spell. But he's really, but that's kind of the, he's kind of the prototypical, millennial. And and that's fine. And he's very actively involved. He just recently got married, which I think is really pretty interesting. And I'm really happy for him. And they're traveling the world together, having this nomadic life that seems to really work for them. And that's great. But that's the millennials. And the thing is that about millennials is they're very, very socially conscious. They know what's happening in the world. Every one of you have passports. And then every one of you have passports that have stamps in them, from places that you've been. See, I grew up in Maine, which is a little tiny state up in the northeast part of the United States. And within 35 miles of where I lived was everybody that was important to me. My grandparents lived in that circle. My aunts and my uncles lived in that circle. My cousins all lived in that circle. We all lived, really close together. And that was life for us. I didn't leave the state of Maine until I was 12 years old, because I didn't think there was anything outside the state of Maine. I thought that was like America. This is America, Maine. No. This is bigger than that. I picked up, National Geographics, and I kind of knew that there was another world out there. I wasn't, quite that dense, but the whole point is that that's the way it was in our generation. But you've traveled, and you've seen things that I've never seen in many instances. I think I've probably seen most of them by now. But the realities are, the troubles and the issues in the world today, and you're really engaged with that. But that wasn't true of our generation. My generation, and my parents did the same exact thing. My parents supported 3 organizations their entire life: the church, Moody Bible Institute, and Radio Bible Class. That's what they did. They were writing checks until they died. And my dad was 98 when he was dying. He's still writing checks, to those 3 organizations faithfully, every month, every week. And that was true with Sue and I. Sue and I have taken on, we have 3 projects that we really believe in. 3 organizations that we've poured a lot of our money into. Now we support other organizations, but we just got like 3. But you have like 30 interests. I mean, it's like what's happening in Guatemala, about, what's happening in Africa, what's happening in other places around the world, and you want to kind of support everything, which is really, really good, but you don't have as much money as your parents did, and so you're giving smaller gifts to more people. And that is a trend that basically is going to define the 21st century nonprofit. We're going to receive more money, but it's going to be less amounts. And that's at least my prediction. When you're old, you can make predictions, and everybody says, well, he's just senile, so don't pay any attention to him. So that's fine. I make these really wild, crazy thoughts and statements. But my prediction is that is going to be the future of philanthropy. So now we got to kind of bring this all around so that it begins to make sense. What's going to happen? Well, I wrote a book not too long ago. It actually was in about 2006. I was looking at the copyright the other day. I think it's 2006 that I wrote it, which was a little bit before, the real crisis hit. And I entitled the book, You Snooze, You Lose. And the subtitle of the book was Thriving in Turbulent Times. In other words, how are we going to thrive in the period of time in which we live? And the purpose of the title of the book was, You Snooze, You Lose. In other words, if you go to bed tonight thinking you're going to wake up tomorrow morning and everything's going to be all better, then you're going to lose some of the most significant opportunities that's ever been given a generation. I believe, this is harvest time for Christians. I believe we have a greater opportunity now to really impact a generation than ever before in human history. There are things that we can do now that I could have even only dreamt about, even 4 or 5 years ago. I mean, that I could go to my office and I could sit down and I could go live on a broadcast that could be broadcast all over the world where anybody could watch it anywhere they were. They could watch it on their iPhone, they could watch it on their iPad, they could watch it on their computer, they could watch it on YouTube. I mean, the communication capabilities are just simply unbelievable. Let's talk about the church situation first of all, because I think the church situation is one that is really becoming a crisis in America. I told you that we've lost more churches in the last year than in the history of America. Churches, if you go to a church where most of the people look like me, then there's some serious problems awaiting. Because it's anticipated by the year 2018, that's the tipping point. 2018, keep that in the back of your mind. Say you heard it first from Jerry. 2018, not that that means anything, but at least I'd like to have some credibility. In 2018, because baby boomers are retiring at the rate of 10,000 a day, and they're going to continue to retire at that level for the next 12 to 15 years. Builders are dying at the rate of 1,000 a day, and that's, that is all going to change too. The older the boomers get, and obviously the older the builders get. And so it's anticipated that by the year 2018, there may be as much as a 60% loss in income that will not be made up of that percentage that builders and boomers are doing now, that will not be made up by successive generations. Now, 60% of 360 billion dollars is what that represents. So it's more than half of that, and that is going to impact organizations. Tithes and offerings are going to go down as the generation gets older, and the millennials are almost not there. They're not walking into churches. They've kind of given up on churches. They think that, like their parents and their grandparents are hypocritical, the church has been hypocritical in the way it's dealt with things, and so they're not running into churches. And so we're predicting, and it's not just us that's predicting this. I mean, there's a lot of predictions in relationship to how many, we know foreclosures are taking place on a regular basis with churches. There's one organization in America right now that basically works with trying to help churches close because they can go through this process. It's a tragic situation, and it's not going to change in the immediate future. So we're losing churches. Now, there are some churches that are doing a great job with millennials, but they're relatively few. And church growth right now, as it's taking place, and there is activity. I mean, obviously, we still have this passion to reach people with the gospel, but they're not coming to church, so how are we going to do it? So some of the real things that are exciting for us as we kind of see what it is that's happening in America, and we're right in the middle of this, and it's not something that we do just casually. We do this every single day in our practice. But we're seeing a lot of churches being established all over the United States that look more like coffee shops than they look like churches. And it's really pretty amazing. What we're seeing is that, there's one church that we're working with that goes into a community that would be fairly, of reasonable size, and they'll put a circle around an area, and somewhere in the middle of that circle they're putting something like a coffee shop or something like that, and that becomes ground zero. And basically their mission is to go out to the people in that community and try to figure out any way that we possibly can to serve them and display the love of Christ. And work is taking place there, every day. Families are coming in, they're doing work, they're ministering out, they're on the ground. And then basically there are other churches that are starting just a few blocks away in another circle that matches up or touches that one, and they're doing the same thing. And they're not allowing themselves to get much larger than 40 or 50 people because they feel like that's a pretty good number to be able to keep the kind of community that they're wanting to create. And as they grow, they'll accommodate that. Some of the Sunday services, they have a Sunday service. In some instances, in the case of our church, they're doing something, the model that looks somewhat similar to that. But in their model on Sunday, they have musicians that show up and do the worship service, and then they live stream the pastor as he's preaching from our mega church, and it's being live streamed into this area. And people, millennials to for the most part, are the ones that basically are doing much of this work and doing the kinds of things that are really making a difference. And the church is looking a little bit different and maybe a little bit better. I was in Bulgaria just last week, and I was with this older gentleman. It was a very interesting conversation, and I don't even know what caused me to ask the question that I did, but we're sitting down, and he spoke reasonably good English, and I said, and he was probably my age or maybe older, and I said to him, I said, you've had the opportunity of living under communism and experiencing what life was like there, and you, of course, obviously live in a totally different world today. Do you think the church was stronger now than it was then? And he gave a very thought-provoking answer. He said, well, he says it's different. He said it really cost someone to be a Christian back in those years. And especially, I suppose, some countries were worse than others. But in Bulgaria, it was kind of tough to be a Christian. We had to worship underground for all practical purposes. It was dangerous. People were looking and watching, and you never knew when somebody was going to come in, cause you to disrupt the whole thing, and maybe even make arrests. And he says we were so tight as a group. He says it was really unbelievable, and I suspect that's true in Romania. You could probably tell the same story, and so I was, the more I heard about it, the more it made sense to me. He said we didn't have other people outside that would support us, so we really came around and embraced one another. We were the closest of friends. We couldn't have been closer friends. And we worked together, and we sought to show the love of Jesus in our lives to others, and we would invite them to come and join us, and sometimes that worked out really well, and sometimes they invited the wrong people, and it resulted in some serious problems for them. And some of you perhaps have heard those stories as well, and you've probably heard many more than I've ever heard. But he said it was really something. We read the Word together, and we spent an awful lot of time praying together, and we held on to one another in these bad times. And then he stopped, and his voice began to quiver a little bit, and there was a tear that kind of dribbled down on his eyes, and he says, I missed that. I really missed that. And he says, it's different now. It's easier to be a Christian. You don't have to make the sacrifices. It's not dangerous to be a Christian like it was when we were around. And he went on to say, he says, I'm not sure. He says, I think it's a little bit shallower, he says, but what we had was really, really deep, and in many respects, I'd like to go back to it. Now, isn't that an amazing statement? But I think it's an amazing statement not because he was necessarily wanting to go back, to the times, as much as he's wanting to go back to the environment that enabled us to have and experience that closeness that has basically been lost, in the masses and in the turmoil and in the noise of the world in which we live now. And so we're seeing churches make some monumental shifts. Our company, and my best friend is an architect, and he owns a company called Building God's Way. And basically, he's been building churches for the last 25 or 30 years, and some of the largest churches in America were built by my friend, including Northlands Church in Orlando, Florida, which when they built it, it was 17,000. Now it's 22,000, and they're generating less income than they were when they were at 17,000. They're ministering to millennials, but the millennials aren't carrying, as much of their share in terms of coming into the congregation as those older ones have essentially paid for. And that's been true. We can literally name probably 30% of the clients, or he can name 30% of the clients that they served in building churches, 10 years ago, that have grown as a result of the building process and have lost income in the process as well. And many of them are struggling to the point of whether or not they can survive, because when they built these buildings, they took out fairly significant mortgages. And now 90% of all the money that comes into the church is basically just covering the expenses of operating the church. And less is going to mission than what was going before. And this is like reality, and it's not necessarily a fun thing to talk about, but obviously it's what it is that's happening in the world today. Now, the other thing to keep in mind, in my book, You Snooze, You Lose, I wrote something. I wrote a lot of things, but when a reviewer reads your book, they kind of focus on one little paragraph or something, and sometimes it's good and sometimes it's bad. And the one paragraph or the one sentence I wrote that several reviewers picked up on was this. I said it would be more likely for a millennial to make an impulsive decision to go to Uganda for a year than it would be for them to put $10 in an offering plate. And you're all kind of nodding. For them, we need to go. Uganda's got a need. Well, by golly, let's get on the phone and get a ticket and let's just go to Uganda for a year. And they'd be more likely to do that than they would be to, put money or make a significant charitable gift to the church of which they're a part. And so it's very important to understand that these people, you wonderful people, I'm not critical at all, believe me. I mean, I can give you all the faults of my generation, so don't misunderstand me. But what you are so wonderful at doing is getting your hands dirty. You want to touch things. You want to make a difference. And if we don't accommodate that in the terms of how we go about preparing for ministry, we're going to lose the incredible capabilities of this most important generation in world history. You guys will shape the world. And last year I was with your brother. We went out to a Habitat for Humanity dedication. It was really kind of a neat experience for me. I have worked with Habitat for Humanity for a number of years, and they were having an event, and Henrik's brother, who is the person who's in charge of Habitat for Humanity, began Habitat for Humanity here in Poland. He said, you need to come down here for this meeting because there's a bunch of university students here. And they are coming, and somebody from Parliament was going to come, somebody from the mayor of the city was there. I'm thinking like I'm just going to go over and say, hey guys, welcome and thanks for coming or whatever. And this was an event. And finally, after the government guy talked and the mayor talked, they asked me if I'd say something. And I looked at this group of students from Emporia University in Emporia, Kansas. And I said I looked to the guy from the government, and I looked to the guy that was the mayor, the lady that was the mayor, and I said, what stands before you is the best that we have in America. This is the best we have to offer. These are students, citizens of the world, and they're going to change the world. And as I'm saying this, all these kids are crying, like, gee, I never thought we were that, but that's exactly what they are. And the realities are we have an army of 100 million of them in America. And imagine if we could deploy that resource into the world, maybe we can make an incredible difference. Now, the other thing that's happening, which I find fascinating, and I wish we had all the answers to this, and Henrik and others of us that really are passionate about what do we do, because at this point in my life, the only thing I want to do is do whatever I can to expand the kingdom of God. I mean, when you get this age, you realize that you've kind of run around the track more than you're going to run around the track, and so now time is more important than it's ever been before, and leveraging every ounce of it is more important to me than ever before. Every ounce of what it is that I have in time, every ounce that I have in what it is that I know, I'm going to share it with anybody that will just sit down and listen to me. But the average millennial, and this is going to be a conservative number, and that was validated by being with a conversation with Steve this morning. And I'd heard the larger number, and I didn't believe it. The larger number that I heard is that the average millennial spends 8 hours a day on social media. 8 hours a day. And so I have been really conservative because I'm thinking that sounds really extravagant. So I was talking to a guy that's what he does. He is a social media expert. He basically is trying to figure out all the things that we need to know in order to be able to transform, the world of which we live. And he works a lot with businesses, so he's not been that committed to working in the ministry sector. But I told him I'm going to pray for him until he, God gives him no rest. And so don't plan for any sleep until I'll stop praying when you tell me, okay, Jerry, I've got the point. But basically, imagine social media has got to be a part of what it is that we're doing in the future. And we need to somehow figure out, and it's not quite been done, we're getting awfully, awfully close of being able to tap the power of social media for the kingdom of God. And I think that should be on everyone's top of their prayer list. I'm going to give you an example of that, which I think is really pretty intriguing. About 4 years ago, I was speaking at a pregnancy care banquet. You know, this is an organization, a pregnancy center was hosting this banquet, and they asked me to be the speaker. Now, I'm often asked to be a speaker at those kinds of events. Number one, because it's been really a passion of mine, and we've helped raise a lot of money for these organizations just because I so believe in them. And I so believe in them, I have to at least parenthetically say this. When I was 7 years old, which had been around 1950, somewhere in there, I went to kindergarten, or 6 years old, I went to kindergarten. And I was the youngest of 3 children. I had 2 older sisters, and so my mother had a lot of time on her hands. You know, like she was been chasing me around up until that point, and she had some time when she didn't have to do that. And she was looking for something to do because she was just, you know, a housewife that basically supported her husband and, you know, all the endeavors that he was involved in. So she decided that a young lady who was experiencing a crisis pregnancy in 1950 was really in the crisis, because abortion wasn't even thought about. And so here's a young lady who became pregnant out of wedlock, and her parents are embarrassed. They're embarrassed for their daughter. They don't want her daughter to be maligned. And so many of those parents, you know, sent their daughters away for a year. And if you wondered where they all were, they were all at our house in Maine. This was the ministry that my mother chose to take on as her personal ministry. And they came from literally all over the United States. Now, my mother was an incredible person. And so they must have negotiated with my parents a little bit. You know, what do we call you while we're here? You know, what do we say? And they're just kind of working. I don't know, but you'll find out how I found this out. But I suspect my parents said, well, just call us Mom and Dad. That's just kind of easy enough for everybody. And so I go to supper one night. And I'm walking into the kitchen, and there's like 4 girls there sitting at the table that I have not a clue who they are. I mean, like, not a clue. And I'm, you know, you're 7 years old. You just have to understand, you're looking at this through 7-year-old eyes. And I'm sitting down, and the habit in our family was we would join hands and we'd pray. And my dad prayed. And we're thanking the Lord for the food. And as soon as he said amen, there was a girl that I had never seen before in my life up until the minutes that I walked in that looked at my dad and said, Dad, would you pass the potatoes? And I'm thinking, and then somebody on the other side of the table is, well, Mom, would you pass the peas? And I'm thinking, what in the world is going on here? My dad spent a lot of time working out in the garage, which I probably is understandable given the fact that there were all these women around. So he'd go back in the garage, and I'm walking out to the garage, you know, and I'm looking at it and say, Dad, says, I know I've got 2 sisters, but which 2 are mine? My dad went to be with the Lord just a few years ago. He was 98 when he died. When he was 90, we had a big birthday party for him. I had 26 sisters show up. 26 sisters. And probably 80 or 100 of their children and their grandchildren and their wives. And I'm thinking to myself, boy, were my parents great. Can you imagine what they sacrificed? They didn't have anything. When they died, we got our inheritance. I think I got $2,114, as I remember, and a box full of mementos that I will treasure for the rest of my life. Of things, pictures of family pictures. I mean, the whole family, and all those kids, and so forth. So when I'm invited to go to these events, and so I'm doing this event, and I'm thinking. And there's like 1,000 people there, okay? So there's a lot of people. And one of the problems with an extrovert is sometimes they think or they speak before they really think it through, you know, and I have been guilty of that, like a lot. and so I am sitting there talking. I says, you know, thank God for your existence, and you've done a wonderful job, but you have to understand that what you're doing is you're still only addressing a symptom. And that's true. Basically, it's only going to, the load of what it is that they're doing and trying to prevent or to try to help young people to make a decision in favor of the life that is growing in their womb, that's just going to continue. And I said, it's what you're doing is great, and God bless you, and we'll continue to support it. But since 1953, in Roe versus Wade, there have been 55 million abortions just in America, and even more in Europe. So, safe ground so far, not really making too many big mistakes until the next statement. And I said, now wouldn't it be something? Now this is when you say that, you're like thinking out of the box. Wouldn't it be something if there were 55 million people in America who would choose to be a voice for one of those children that never had the opportunity to speak? And they demonstrated that choice by considering a contribution of $10 a year. Maybe we could work in the world to build a culture of life. And again, have people revere the sanctity of human life. And everybody stood up and clapped. And I am standing there saying, what have I said? I have not a clue how to do this. But 55 million people giving $10 a year is $550 million. Imagine what we could do with $550 million spread around the world trying to build, a culture of life in these worlds where basically it's been disregarded. Maybe we could change the world. We're going to launch that campaign in January of this year. And you're going to see it start, and whether we get 55 million or a million, every single dollar in its entirety is going to go, to basically solve a problem. I'm not doing this to make money. I'm just doing this, hopefully, with the essence that we can really make a difference in changing the world. And you know something? I think we can change the world. Imagine if we had, 100,000 people in Poland that said, we want to reach our country, with the gospel of Jesus Christ. I mean, imagine what we could do in starting churches, like you're interested in doing, Thomas, and others, and all kinds of other things. But I think that's, at least a significant part of what it is that needs to happen if we're going to leverage the times in which we live. And we've just touched upon a few things. There's all kinds of wonderful things that are happening, but I do believe that in the context of God's grace, that He has given us the opportunity to live in one very, very exciting time. Henrik's ministry with Jesus.net, just not only in Poland, but as it's taking place as a board member all throughout the world. What an incredible ministry. And basically, with not an awful lot of money, we could expand it so that it's available in every country in the world. And we really must do that. I mean, that just must be done. And so I pray for you that God will give you wisdom as you're kind of growing your ministry. I think we need to get a little bit outside the box a little bit and kind of look at things differently, because doing the same thing in the same way and expecting different results, it's always been absurdity, and now it's moving into this area of insanity. And so we really must make changes because there's too much at stake.